Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today in the Cryosphere Pavilion for the session Creating Space for Nature, Visions of Arctic Futures Aligned with 1.5-degree emission reduction. I would like to start the session with a short animation video that was released several years ago, also in the Cryosphere Pavilion.
The Arctic is warming almost 3 times faster than the planet, changing the Arctic ecosystems forever, causing destruction around the planet. Once Arctic ice melts, we can't get it back. We can't negotiate the melting point of ice.
A lot of things have changed since COP meeting in Glasgow in 2021, when this animation was released. And yet nothing really changed when it comes to stopping global temperatures rising and melting Arctic environments. The 50 by 30 mentioned in this video was an alliance between Cryosphere research institutions and governments asking for bolder and fast emission reductions, 50% by 2030, to prevent cascading and irreversible damage on a planetary scale from the impacts of greenhouse gas emissions on the cryosphere. And here we are, 3 years later, with global emissions reaching even higher levels, according to the most recently published report by UNEP on the emission gap. It seems that collectively, the human civilization is sleepwalking into its own demise, causing the destruction of ecosystems and the extinction of species. And although there is no luck in diagnosing about what is causing this triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and environmental pollution, we still lack a convincing narrative that can help us to get us from here to a place where we want to be, and most importantly, to where we want our children and grandchildren to be. We know where we don't want to be. We don't want to be in a place where there is no Arctic glaciers, no Greenland ice sheet, no species that depend on ice. We don't want an Arctic where indigenous and coastal communities are displaced because of coastal flooding. We don't want to be in such a world. This session brings together a very special group of people: visionaries, activists, leaders, thinkers, practitioners from different walks of life, cultures, ages, yet sharing fundamentally the same desire to see the Arctic ecosystems and communities retaining their resilience, functions, and identity in the face of intensifying challenges and pressures. My name is Elena Tracy, and I'm a senior advisor on sustainable development with the Global Arctic Program, WWF, and I will moderate this session today in Baku. This session will consist of 2 parts. The first part will overview the current trends in growing pressures coming from the growth in the extractive sectors in the Arctic. Because of climate change, the Arctic is losing its natural safeguards against extractive industries wanting to tap into its marine and terrestrial environments containing non-renewable resources, such as fossil fuels and metals, in the areas that were previously considered as inaccessible for those types of activities. These growing ambitions of the extractive industries are accompanied by the increasing shipping traffic. So more vessels take mineral commodities produced in the Arctic and deliver them to global markets. We will also consider a different alternative pathway that is becoming more visible and prominent in the Arctic, the adoption of sustainable blue economy, of circular economy principles that reduce the demand for primary minerals, and the growth in renewable energy approaches, among the few to mention. In the second part of the session, the participants are invited to deliberate solutions and share their visions and their experience that can get us to the Arctic futures consistent with the 1.5 world. Without further ado, I welcome our first speaker, Ksenia Bakusheva, to give a presentation on the trends in the extractive sector in the Russian side of the Arctic. Ksenia is a policy advisor and project manager at Bellona International. Ksenia analyzes the impacts of the extractive industries and pollution in the Russian Arctic, as well as the shipping along the Northern Sea route. Ksenia holds a PhD in economics and has experience in analytical research, teaching, and journalism.
Thank you, Yelena. Good morning, dear participants. Please excuse my remote presence. Unfortunately, I couldn't go to the conference in person. First, briefly about Bellona, if you don't know the organization. Bellona is an international environmental science-based organization with a headquarters in Norway. Since 1994, Bellona has been working in Russia, in Murmansk and in St. Petersburg, but after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Bellona closed its offices in Russia and relocated employees to Lithuania to continue analysis of the environmental risks originating in Russia with a focus on nuclear safety and industrial pollution and climate change in the Arctic. Now to the topic of the presentation. Here you can see how many natural resources are extracted in the Russian Arctic compared to the whole Russia. Diamonds, nickel, cobalt, natural gas, copper, and predominantly extracted in the Arctic. And according to governmental plans, those shares will rise so that the extractive industry in the Arctic region will expand more than in other parts of the country. Most of the extracted resources go for export. Existing industry has already left serious environmental impacts in many areas, Arctic areas. Here you can see clusters with the highest pollution caused by mining of coal, nickel, copper, and extracting of oil. It's worth mentioning that all those industrial sites were constructed by Gulag prisoners in Soviet times and without involvement or taking into account interests of the local population. The latter malpractice flourishes today as well. Next, there is a map with the current biggest emitters. These 300 industrial sites produce more than 60% of all emissions in Russia. 30 of those sites are located in the Arctic zone. It's mostly oil and natural gas fields, nickel, copper, and coal mining. In the table, you can see emissions and wastes from those 30 sites. They are owned by 9 companies and represent 5 industries. According to data from the Russian Environmental Oversight Agency Rosprodnadzor, polluting emissions figures self-reported by Russian enterprises show that Norilsk Nickel and Gazprom lead all others by a significant margin. Emissions of greenhouse gases are also huge. Even though data on greenhouse gases are grossly underestimated by Rosprodnadzor, their presence in the Russian Arctic is nonetheless far greater than in any other Arctic country. Gazprom's Arctic operations emit roughly the same as every source, including transport in Alaska. It's also 1.5 times greater than emissions from all industries in Canada's Arctic provinces, included non-Arctic southern Quebec. These numbers are quite old, from 2021, because Rosprodnadzor stopped publishing emissions data for each industrial site. And together with the new so-called sovereign methodology for counting greenhouse gas emissions presented yesterday by Russia, which surprisingly counted 1/3 less net emissions than it was according to international methodology, it creates a situation when Russian data on industrial emissions cannot be trusted. Targets for extractive industry in the Russian Arctic set in the strategy for the development until 2035. More oil and gas extraction, more mining, and at the same time, no targets for emissions and discharges. They should be suggested by the end of this year, but there is no publicly available plans yet. The next table shows Russian mining plans for the Arctic sites until 2030. Some of them are almost ready to start production. Construction of others has not yet been started. But if all of those projects go into operations, it will add at least 25 million tons of greenhouse gases and at least 1.5 million of toxic air pollutants from production only, mainly from oil and gas projects, and a lot of waste from metal mining. International sanctions against Russian companies and industries reduced speed of the development of these major sites. Arctic LNG production is highly questionable now. Vostok oil has seen difficulties, but there is still big potential for other countries to ban Russian resources mined in the Arctic with a significant harm to nature and climate. Some examples of the environmental pollution that we should expect on the next 3 slides. Alluvial mining of gold had already polluted thousands of kilometers of rivers in southern Siberia and Far East. It will inevitably bring same kind of pollution to the Arctic, as a lot of new sites for gold mining were given for exploration and mining there. Lack of state control, low fines, and high profitability makes companies neglect environmental regulations. Open pit mining of coal in Chukotka is an example of how interests and health of the local indigenous peoples are not taken into account. Coal dust covers Arctic surface, badly influencing vegetation and health of locals. Miners work on the rotation basis and don't have a connection with the land, while locals are fully dependent on authorities and mining company in supplies. It makes impossible and sometimes dangerous for them to raise voice against malpractices of the business. New challenges which appeared after the Russian invasion of Ukraine and its attempt to avoid international sanctions is high risk of oil spills in the ocean. Growing shadow fleet of old uninsured tankers transporting illegal Russian oil is a time bomb. There are already signs of spills around Europe and Asia. With the Russian plans to increase use of the Northern Sea route, those tankers might transport oil to Asia by it, and then it is a matter of time when an accident with the oil spill happens in the Arctic. In the end of my presentation, I would like to remind that the pollution in the Russian Arctic occurs with almost no possibility for timely and independent public control. All international environmental NGOs were declared undesirable and banned from the country. Local activists and organizations are highly pressured. Gongos took over real NGOs and associations of indigenous people. And finally, main takes from my presentation. First, we should expect increase in pollution and greenhouse gas emissions from extractive industry in the Russian Arctic in the coming decade. Second, Russian data on industrial emissions cannot be trusted. Third, there is a high risk of oil pollution in the Arctic waters. And the fourth, that Russian Arctic natural resources should be considered to be banned on the international markets, both for environmental reasons and to limit Russia's capacity to continue its war against Ukraine. Thank you for your attention. Ready for the question if there is time.
Oh, thank you, Ksenia, for your presentation. The situation with the scope and the impact of their extractive sector in Russia is more than alarming. However, the trend of growing extractivism in the Arctic is not limited to Russia alone. Next speaker, Vance Colbert, Senior Policy Advisor with the International Institute in Sustainable Development, will offer an overview of the oil and gas sector in the entire Arctic region. Vance is a Senior Policy Advisor with the International Institute of Sustainable Development's Energy Program. He works on promoting solutions for an equitable transition away from fossil fuel production and aligning the energy sector with Paris Agreement targets. Vance has over 20 years of experience leading development and humanitarian programs with a broad range of civil society actors and UN agencies. Vance has worked extensively across the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America, and was a founding board member of Climate and Sustainability.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Ksenia, for that sobering overview of the environmental impacts of what's going on in Russia at the moment. I wanted to just take a step back and look at the global oil and gas production. We can move on to the next slide. Just get the slides. So ISD has done a bunch of modeling work on how much oil and gas can be produced in order to remain consistent with 1.5 degrees, either the IEA net zero pathway or the IPCC 1.5 degree pathways. And basically, it's clear that producing fields and fields under development globally already have more than enough oil and gas that we can use in order to meet these targets. The basic message on this is no new oil and gas. I think we hear this message more and more amplified by certain actors in top. What are we seeing in the Arctic and what are we seeing globally? Well, we're seeing instead a race to increase production. We're seeing a race to increase production by almost all Arctic countries. There is a ban on drilling in Greenland and Iceland. There's currently a ban on new drilling in Canada. This unfortunately ends in 2025, and we'll see which government's in power at that point in time, whether or not that ban gets extended or not. Norway continues to expand its Arctic extraction of oil and gas. The U.S. is the second largest producer in the Arctic. It has some bans in place, but is a significant producer on the North Slope. And just after the election, Biden opened up the first auction area in the Arctic National Protected zone. However, 91% of production is in Russia, as we just heard in the last presentation. So I put together a little graph here. You might think, looking at there, that the production in Russia is actually, we're just talking about production in the Arctic here. But it's starting to come down a little bit. Unfortunately, we have the Vostok project, which is starting to come online. It's supposed to really come online next year and ramp up over the next few years. That's going to be another very large project, the largest actually in the world in about 10 years, which is going to bring about 2 million more barrels per day into global capacity. There's no space for this in today's 1.5 aligned pathway. Looking at Alaska, this is a significant project. It's obviously much smaller than Vostok, but it's nonetheless quite significant environmental impacts and impacts on migration routes. This is called the Willow Project on the North Bank. Why is it important, this relatively new project? Because it allows the Trans-Alaska Pipeline to remain viable. Without it, the pipeline probably couldn't exist anymore and keep all those other oil fields viable. And therefore, the new production, which is expected to come in the coming years, will take advantage of those pipelines. Now, if you look beyond just production in the Arctic countries, of course, are among the biggest producers in the world. The United States is by far the biggest, followed by Russia. Canada is also a very major producer. And Norway is a significant producer not compared to those other ones, but certainly on a global scale. And all of them are undergoing rapid or at least moderate expansion. And a lot of that expansion is happening in the Arctic. What does this mean? So on the first slide, we saw that there's no space on the 1.5 degree aligned world for new expansion. But some of the people we engage with say, nonetheless, the market is there. Well, the International Energy Agency says we're going to reach peak production or peak consumption by 2030 in both oil and gas. And yet there's a race to increase production across the Arctic and by Arctic countries. What are going to be the likely consequences of this? The consequences are going to be stranded assets. We have studies showing that there could be $1.5 trillion of stranded assets. We've already seen in Canada and in other countries that when companies go bankrupt, they often leave all the environmental cleanup costs for government or local community to deal with. Of course, there's the risks, the spillage risks and the increased shipping risks that were talked about in the first presentation. And then there's the issue of economic dependency by local communities in many of these areas, and a lack of any kind of just transition planning for what's going to happen if we do pass peak oil and start to face abandoned oil fields across the world. So, if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out and back over to you.
Well, thank you, Vance. I would like to say a few words about other industrial pressures in the region related, and they also related to expansion of the extractive sector. And I would like to mention a few silver linings. New developments that present a viable alternative as an economic model to extractivism that is based on polluting industries and extraction of non-renewable resources. So my next presentation, please. So as sea ice is melting and retrieving, new sea routes are opening and the shipping traffic is increasing. Shipping serves an important social function in the Arctic. It is a lifeline for many coastal communities, delivering necessities, food, and providing transportation. Yet there is another type of shipping activities associated with growing mineral extraction, and its traffic is increasing. So this slide shows the area between the Canadian Arctic archipelago, more known today as the Inuit Nunangat, Inuit homeland, and Greenland. The area is important for migration of bowhead whales, narwhal, and beluga whales. We call this area as Arctic Blue Corridors. It's a bottleneck, one of the bottlenecks of the Arctic Blue Corridors, a very important area for mammal migration. On the slide, we see the dramatic changes in bulk carrier traffic. And by bulk carrier, I mean these big bulk carrier vessels, they take minerals, the metals, and deliver them. So they're really heavy to be able to carry those weights. So in the last decade, you see the traffic has increased dramatically in these bulk carriers. And it has been driven primarily by the development in the Mary River iron ore mining project, which commenced on Canadian Baffin Island in 2014. The iron ore is carried by bulk carriers, and those carriers are also using HFO, heavy fuel oil, which is the most polluting oil and has a high risk of spill. In the case of spill, it will be a disaster for the marine environment. They're also very noisy, and this underwater noise is very harmful to marine mammals. And this is only one example that I can share with you of the increased shipping of these types of vessels in the Arctic. There is more examples. But now I came to my next point. Yes, there is a lot of expansion in the extractive sector in the Arctic, as presented by previous speakers. And there's also new challenges like the prospects of deep seabed mining, pushing the frontiers of extractivism deep into the ocean. And there's also proposals for new mining projects in the very far north. But this is not the full story, and that's why we're here right now. There is a silver lining, new activities, local projects, large investments, small-scale investments, individual and community efforts around the ideas of sustainable blue economy, the principle of circular economy to reduce the demand for primary metals. There are big initiatives on assessing the future of new offshore wind areas in Norway, and there's local initiatives in smaller scale wind power projects because local communities do not always want to welcome big projects that are brought upon them by, again, some corporate company with investors elsewhere. There are also culture-oriented local economies, some artists moving up north, opening their workshops and galleries, creating clusters of Arctic artists. I observed this in Yellowknife in Canada, and so forth. So are those local movements strong enough? What is needed to make them successful in creating a real alternative to the current resource-oriented model? So I'm really pleased to welcome our next speaker, Kevin Allwright, joining us remotely. Kevin is the Secretary General, not of the UN yet, he's Secretary General of the International Windship Association. It is a non-profit organization of marine visionaries and practitioners who share the passion for reducing the impact of shipping on nature and climate. With the help of wind power, green propulsion technologies. Gavin holds a master's degree in sustainable development, specializing in small-scale sustainable shipping and logistics in developing countries, and he contributed as an expert reviewer to the IPCC special report on 1.5 global warming. So Gavin, so you have a vision for the future of shipping. From my earlier points, we saw many negative impacts that come from shipping in the Arctic to marine and coastal ecosystems, like underwater noise, increased pollution, black carbon emissions, and so forth. Your association brings together visionaries like yourself who see a very different shipping industry in the Arctic. So can you please share with us your vision?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Right. For some reason my my screen is hello.
Okay, that looks good now.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. For some reason that's going a little bit slow. Okay, I'll just go to the screen if I can get a full screen. Okay, just a moment. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble with getting the screen up. Okay, can you see my screen now?
Not yet. Now we do. Yes, we do.
Okay, lovely. Yes. So my apologies, and I'm sorry that I can't be with you in Baku, and I hope the negotiations are going well. Now, I remember attending a sustainable shipping conference in Canada back in 2011, and one of the presenters there talked about the Northwest Passage being effectively open because the ice covering that shipping region was simple 1-year ice. So any ship, any large vessel that was ice class could actually break through that ice and use that passage. Now, the environmental side of the audience just saw the risk of pollution and some real challenges there. Of course, the shipping executives saw really an opportunity and dollar signs were in their eyes. Now, with wind propulsion, which I'm going to talk about today, we actually have a middle path here where we can still have shipping and the opportunities that brings to the region, but really mitigating and reducing that potential pollution and other risks, and also helping with sustainable livelihoods for local indigenous populations. Just very quickly, the energy transition that we're talking about, obviously we have a lot of energy transition aspects on land. In shipping, actually we've done all of this before. We actually came from a globally zero emissions, perfect zero emissions shipping world, which was using wind, a little bit of human power, converted that to fossil fuels, and now we're actually heading back. So we're into shipping 4.0 with wind propulsion being brought into the mix. As mentioned before, I don't have very much time, but I just thought I'd introduce the association. We're actually a global association with nearly 200 members. These are everything from small technology developers, research and development organizations, shipping companies, shipyards, pretty much the whole ecosystem of wind propulsion developments. But what is wind propulsion? So very quickly, we're talking about harnessing the wind directly onto the ship. So thinking about all of those pirate ships in films like the Pirates of the Caribbean, we're actually talking about a 21st century technology development package or basket of technologies, which don't always look like what you would traditionally think of as wind propulsion. But we're talking about harnessing a zero emissions energy source that's delivered directly to the ship at the point of use for free forever on the vessel. If we retrofit these onto existing ships, we're talking between 5 to 20% of the propulsive energy source, optimized up to around 30%. But if we are new building, then we can actually incorporate 50% right up to 100% and even potentially higher than 100%, where the ship is harnessing the wind and any excess wind is turned into electricity or alternative fuels on board. And there are actually 7 different technology groups, but I won't go through those today. Now, what are the benefits and what does this mean for the Arctic? Well, we've got the general benefits of the fact that we're reducing emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and all other emissions, such as black carbon or soot, particulate matter, volatile organic compounds, etc., which have localized huge impact on ice flow. But other wind propulsion benefits, when we're able to, for example, in heavy weather, which is obviously a major issue within the Arctic region, actually having wind propulsion on board the vessels lessens the propeller load of those vessels. And we just heard earlier about underwater radiated noise. That can be significantly reduced by the wind propulsion element on board. Most of the underwater radiated noise is actually generated by cavitation of the propeller. So it's these exploding air bubbles at certain speeds and certain propeller loads. Wind propulsion can significantly reduce that. Also, in marine protective areas and other sensitive areas where we have mammals migrating or in breeding grounds, you have the option to basically go completely noise-free or quiet sailing by switching over directly to wind propulsion. We're also able to extend the range of vessels, so avoiding spawning grounds or other sensitive areas, but not increasing the amount of fuel that's required. And of course, research and monitoring on wind vessels, if they're primary wind vessels, you're reducing noise and vibration on the vessels, so much better for research and monitoring of Arctic conditions. Then in operation, you're also looking at wind routing, so we're able to use space assets, LiDAR, and extensive routing. So we're able to actually reduce the emissions further by understanding the weather patterns and the changing weather patterns in real time to affect those vessels. The payback or ROI on the systems, actually, if we were able to roll out 20% of wind across the entire fleet in the Arctic and also elsewhere, actually the savings by 2050 in fuel would effectively pay for all of the other low emissions technologies and fuels that we require. So we could do the transition 100%, 0% increase in cost as of today. So we could have our cake and eat it effectively. But also we can generate sustainable jobs in the region. And because wind is accessible to everyone, this also feeds into the just and equitable transition that is fundamental for the development. And finally, there's also the resilience side of things. When fuel costs are very volatile, they're also very high, especially in peripheral areas such as the Arctic. We have supply fluctuations, and of course, a disaster response. When you have that flexibility of having wind and your engines, it actually gives you 2 options and allows you to stay out and service those areas for longer. Just a couple of quick additional slides. One is just on this underwater radiated noise to give you an idea of the impact. We have one vessel, a standard conventional vessel. If we were to put 40% of wind onto vessels that were operating, we would effectively be, you could operate 25 ships with that 40% wind, would generate the same amount of underwater radiated noise as one conventional vessel. So a dramatic decrease. Just to give you an idea, finally, on the market at the moment, we have 50 large vessels, actually 57 large vessels installed currently, which is around about 4 million deadweight tons of shipping, meaning roughly 4 million tons of cargo is already being moved at any given time with wind, either wind assist or primary wind on those vessels. Pushing this out to 2030 and 2050, estimates have put it between 10 to 15% of the fleet could be wind installed by 2030, 40 to 45% of the fleet by 2050, unless we make decisions to go faster and deeper. Then we could effectively go up to 100%. This is my last slide. One of the big problems within shipping is that it's always looked at the return on investment over a very short period of time, looking at only greenhouse gases, not the total emissions profile, and also looking at the cost of equipment over a 3 to 5 year period, and also the emissions there, rather than looking at the total length of the lifetime of the ship of 25 to 30 years. If we want to have appropriate policies to push this sector, we need to be looking at that total cost of ownership there. So thank you very much. I'm more than happy to answer any questions either now or after. Thank you.
Thank you, Gavin. This is truly inspiring. And it has the support of the winds now blowing in the same direction that now come from the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, that is pushing really hard the implementation of its new decarbonization strategy worldwide and in the Arctic. So now I'm turning to discussing the way forward. From after listening to all this data and ideas and realities and the possibilities for the future. So I would like us now to discuss the visions of Arctic futures compatible with 1.5 degree. We are very lucky to have today joining us two youth representatives from Arctic indigenous organizations. Per Henning Mathisen is Sami, and he is based in the northern part of Norway. Mathisen holds a master's degree in teaching education and Nordic languages from the University of Tromsø. Mathisen is involved in Sami Council advocacy program, which seeks to provide insights and experiences for future work on Sami and indigenous peoples' issues at a national and international level. Mathisen grew up in a small coastal Sami village connected to the land and sea. And the second youth speaker is Louis Papi Chemnitz from the Inuit Circumpolar Council, Greenland. Louis was born and raised in Nuuk, Talalallit, Nunat, Greenland. He holds a bachelor degree in Arctic Social Sciences at the University of Greenland, where he is now pursuing a master's degree on social sciences. He is an academic intern at the Inuit Circumpolar Council, where he has worked as a student assistant, and he is engaged in community building activities in Nuuk, with activities for children, youth, adults, and elders. He has also worked as a substitute teacher in Nuuk for several years. So welcome. And my first question to you guys, I don't know who's going to go first, maybe Per Henning. So maybe please tell us a few words about the place where you grew up, your past experiences, and in your mind's eye, how do you see this place and how you see the Arctic maybe in 10 years or 20 years from now?
Yes, thank you for the question. I hope you're all able to hear me well. I grew up in a small coastal Sami village with a connection to the land and the sea. And being in the Arctic nature has always been a great part of my upbringing through activities such as fishing, both on the inland and on the sea, summer as winter, harvesting, pollination, and other outdoor activities throughout the year. And to me and many other Sami youth, the Arctic environment is home and something that we must treat with the same respect as our previous generations have done. In the Sami worldview, nature is not something that we do here. but rather something that we are a part of, and something that we must treat with care with the future generations in mind. Therefore, we don't take more than we need from nature. We leave as little traces as possible after ourselves in nature, and we make sure that the future generations have the same opportunities as we have to harvest what nature has to offer. And I think that our well-being as indigenous peoples depends on the Arctic nature as we know it today. However, we are facing several threats in our society as indigenous people, and climate change is one of them, affecting our culture on several fronts. Changes in the environment are threatening our traditional livelihoods, not only making it harder to adapt to the climate changes, but also in facing the threats of the green transition or the green colonialism. It's a paradox that the so-called green transition that is supposed to save the climate is actually threatening our nature and our traditional and already sustainable livelihoods. If we lose connection to our land, we do not only lose our livelihoods, we also lose our indigenous culture, traditions, languages, and identity. And we diminish as a people. So indigenous knowledge must be the center of decision-making processes on climate issues. As today, decisions are being made without the consent of indigenous peoples, resulting in our lands being stolen and our rights being violated. The Fulton case is only one example of that, where 151 wind turbines were built illegally on Sami reindeer herding into pastures on the Fulton Peninsula in Norway, which resulted in a violation of human rights. We cannot accept the greenwashing of climate policies that prevent our future generations from having the opportunity to harvest from and live in and of our nature. For us to have a future in the Arctic, we depend on a climate policy that includes all levels in decision making, that is based on the knowledge of indigenous peoples, that is adapted to local contexts. Future projects on indigenous land must be done in cooperation and be based on indigenous peoples' self-determination. Indigenous peoples of the Arctic have a lot in common when it comes to experiences, challenges, and making sure our indigenous knowledge gets heard. Also when facing climate change. Yet, as mentioned previously, the Arctic region is diverse, and therefore it is important that we have a platform to share our experiences and indigenous knowledge with each other. It is especially important for indigenous Arctic youth in order to make shared decisions facing climate change. And in my view, youth are ready to participate and act on reducing the effects of climate change already today to make a better future. But it cannot be the responsibility of the youth alone to act on this, and we cannot have a green transition without justice. It is up to political will to act upon necessary measures for not only a green transition, but also a just transition that will not be a continuation of the colonization of our lands. That includes decision-making on different levels and integration of the perspectives of indigenous and Arctic peoples and youth, and indigenous knowledge on the premises of indigenous peoples. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for Henning. This is a very important point that you've made in the end as well, that the green transition should necessarily include the component of just transition and incorporate the voices and the interests of the indigenous peoples. And there's a lot of, right now, the debates and voices being brought up in relations to some of the green projects that are being planned or already developed in the Arctic, in the Norwegian Arctic, with the wind power projects. Maybe Gunbreed will speak a little bit later about it. I don't know if she has vision, but that's a really important point. And so now we will turn to Ian, and maybe the same question, like, can you share with us some of your experience? You grew up in North, right? So, and I don't know how it was like, I don't know how old you are, and I'm not going to ask you, but you are very young. But if you remember, even within your lifetime, like how did it change as in your own experience? And what do you see for Norway and for Greenland in 10 or 20 years from now? Because it is changing, the environment in Greenland is changing so rapidly.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm still young. I still consider myself a youth. And I also want to thank my Arctic colleagues and their inspiring connection to nature that we share also with Inuit across the Inuit homeland. Also, thank you for the video you showed earlier, where we see the changes in the Arctic. It's a very visual thing, and often you see a lot of numbers and stats and graphs when we think about the climate change, but we also know that it's affecting people's lives, it's affecting cultures, it's affecting mental health, indigenous peoples, languages, and so on. So first I want to speak a little bit of the role of youth. And when I think of youth, they have a certain sense of hope, but also action, which I think are really important when trying to combat climate change. But I also think the youth point out the need to redefine leadership. I think we see it in examples, presentations, but also other spaces, that we need to redefine what leadership is, and also really think about the future. And I think that's one part where youth, they want to have a healthy environment now, but also in the future. And we cannot simply think of the future or this current status as it is now, but how interlinked it is with our lives. So I think youth, they want, a good life in terms of the social, the cultural, the economic, spiritual, in all its aspects. And I think we also see the strength in diversity. I think the youth today are even more connected to the entire world than the previous generations of youth have been. But we also see the need to really strengthen the sense of diversity, which includes indigenous peoples, which includes meaningful engagement. And ultimately, all decisions taken now are directly linked to my future hopes, to my future well-being, to the future of my children also. And I think that's an important relationship that youth have in spaces like these, that we know that it's going to affect my life differently, that it's going to affect someone who maybe has a shorter span of life. I think youth feel the race focus on the Arctic, and we appreciate it. I think we see both the challenges in the Arctic, but also the opportunities in the Arctic. And I think youth also want to be part of the focus, that we are the people living in the Arctic. And when we talk about the cryosphere in the Arctic, there are people living there versus the Antarctic. I think that's also something we feel is important to address. I think you would want to see a new relation to nature, and I think some of the values that we are heading on sharing really, in the eyes of youth, inform international cooperation. And we see that nature is more than numbers and grand achievements, but it's a link with who we are as human beings. And I think this point of the human dimension of climate change is something that Arctic indigenous peoples have been bringing for decades, and the peoples of the world will feel that more and more as their climate change is happening in more populated places also, which we have been feeling for many decades. When we talk about, as we see here, 1.5, it doesn't really count for the Arctic, as we have passed this, that we know that the Arctic is getting warmer and warmer 3 to 4 times faster than the global average.
So for us, we see the urgency of the time we're in, and that the 1.5 is now behind us. And I think another aspect of this human life is when we take the example of the approach to polar bears in the Arctic as a very clear example, that polar bears is one part of the elements of nature which cannot undermine the people of the Arctic. So as Arctic indigenous peoples, of course, we want to protect polar bears and every other animals, but it cannot be on the cost of the people's lives. And in Greenland, we have had polar bears coming to the cities and towns more and more. And recently in south of Greenland, there were polar bears walking in the streets just around the school time of the children. And luckily for us, there was no harm. But we feel the impacts of the climate change, of polar bears coming to our towns. We cannot value these more than the children that are walking to school and sporting. In terms of the Arctic in the future, again, reiterating that the Arctic is made up of ice, but also of people, and that we are living there, and we have been living there for generations and generations. And therefore, again, we need this just transition that includes many aspects and dimensions. So we believe that all Arctic indigenous peoples must have full and effective participation and meaningful engagement in all the decisions that impact them through this process of the right to self-determination. It also includes the free, prior, and informed consent, but this comes after this right of self-determination. This also goes with any form of research that the indigenous peoples also included in the whole process of research, not just at the end. And it also turns away from a tokenistic way of including people. But we have to be involved in the entire process, also using indigenous knowledge. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the UNRWA, affirm the fundamental importance of the right to self-determination of all people to determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. And I think this is important to remember. Also important to remember that the Arctic indigenous people are not against any form of development, but we want to do it in a way where we include it, where we have the right to determine also what is happening. And I think this example of the shipping sales ship is a very good example where we can learn to use nature in a way that's very harmonious and non-destructive, which has been the way of living for Arctic indigenous people. I think going back to this way of adjustment and inclusive discourse and international cooperation is something we've been speaking of, where we understand that it will only enrich the conversation. We're not trying to undermine other people's participation, but we recognize that our participation in these discourses will only enrich, strengthen our understanding of reality, and contributing with our knowledge will also help us understand better. I think what we've seen is that any effort that affects a people cannot exclude that people, which we have felt many times. Climate change is affecting us, but we should bear the cost. With this example of the coastal lines, for example. I think what we've been talking of also in the Arctic, the need to get all peoples together, believing that when we are united, we are better able to address these common challenges that we have. And the less united we are, the more difficult it is to actually address these challenges without creating more and more challenges that we then later also need to inform. But this is a very short vision of trying to fix a problem, but then creating other problems. And we know these problems will then be on us to then try to fix. We grow. So I think our point is to find these common point of agreement, and that's where we need to build unity and to really work with these challenges that we do have. And again, I think we're trying to remember, this the highest purpose of this, I think, as a youth, is to really create the best possible future for humanity. And I think it's something we bring again and again, which includes all peoples. Climate change is not happening in a few places, but the entire world. So the need to include the entire world is very relevant. I think I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. That's beautiful. Thank you both, Lee and Kenny, for sharing your experiences and your visions and emphasizing the need to really ensure that there is a just transition that incorporates indigenous voices of the local communities, coastal communities, the people who are actually there in the Arctic, that are experiencing all the challenges and changes right now. So now I would like to welcome another guest and speaker, Ms. Gunn-Britt Retter, who is also Sami, as Kenny, and she's based in Norway. Ms. Retter holds a degree in teaching from the Sami University of Applied Sciences and in bilingual studies from the University of Wales. Retter has combined her academic knowledge with the skills she learned from her family and community growing up in the land and sea, and now using indigenous people's knowledge on climate change, biodiversity, language, pollution, and natural resource management. Ms. Retter has more than 20 years experience in working in with Arctic affairs and has served the Sami Council for 19 years as the head of the Arctic and Environmental Unit. Her main role is to coordinate Sami Council's participation in the Arctic Council and in the UN CBD and the UNFCCC. So dear Gunn-Britt, so I just want maybe a kind of a frame a question for you, but feel free to pick up any components in that question and maybe just take on with some other ideas. What knowledge and experience unique to Arctic indigenous peoples, and we already talked about it here, should inform the new visions about Arctic future that are sustainable and accommodating and ensure equitable transition? In what ways can the Sami tradition inform the proposed new developments that are now taking off in Norway and maybe elsewhere in the Arctic?
Yes, I don't know if you can hear me. It's really hard. And thank you. The first part was really depressing, so I'm kind of not sure where I should start in my notes. And also brilliant perspectives here. And we also ran out of time.
No, we are fine.
Oh, we are fine. Okay. Maybe I would first like to start then with, I'm also the member of the facility working group of the local community and indigenous peoples platform under the Climate Convention. And one of the purposes with this platform is to elevate the leadership role that indigenous peoples play in the collective effort towards transformational climate policy making and action, and our rich and recognize our rich distinct values, worldviews, and knowledge systems cultivated through generations of close relationship with Mother Nature. And I want to reference to this platform because there is a recognition of that we have something to contribute with our values, worldviews, and knowledge systems in the transformative change of the Arctic. And this platform works as an arena to gather and formulate, to get us together and share this knowledge and worldviews so we can transform them also into the decision making. And having this as a formal platform of the Climate Convention, I have experienced over this 2.5 years that we are gaining the recognition also from other constitutional bodies and the Climate Convention system. So it's a slow process, but I think over the years we can really change the world with this different way of thinking than we have seen from the first part of the presentations here. And that leads me to to another thing which wasn't touched upon here yet, and which I have been wondering a lot about, and that is the consumption path that we as a society, as a humankind, is on, including me personally. So that's why I often bring my booksy with me to the meetings. There's no coffee to get here into it, but could survive that later. But I think that bringing a booksy is a very symbolic. Symbolicity, what's that? Symbolism of saying that traditional practices as something to contribute to less consumption, because I try to prevent having too many paper cups or plastic cups or taking too many cups and too much dishwashing. It's very simple saying, but I hope that can generate some thinking on individual level on what we are actually doing in our daily life. And bringing this from my micro personal level with this very little literacy to world leaders to adopt that way of thinking of the consumption patterns and the traditional practice is something to contribute to larger decision making. And I, in a way, would challenge the world leaders to think differently. And to conclude that the line of thought, I think it's quite, and I'm a bit short of English words, but it's a paradox that people take elevator to go to the fitness field. I mean, you are burning energy for no reason, and it's for no use. And then you even spend energy in the elevator to go in the basement or the rooftop in a hotel to produce energy, which is not used for anything. My mom would call that very glamorous. It's waste of time, energy, and resources. And also there was a report in Norway, I just heard it briefly on the radio, I didn't manage to find back to it. The industry is, and I'm not addressing anything in what I heard here, I just went on a totally different path. We have this push for electrical cars, electrical bicycles, electrical everything. And then the demand for mining, which comes with that. And the mines, we are looking to place in our lands as well, because it's for a greater good that we have to give up our lands for this kind of alternative energy consumption. But this report I heard briefly referred to in Norwegian radio broadcasting was that people drive more when they have access to electrical car. Was that the idea? That we are like spending more because we can. And so we have to do something with the human mind, and I haven't found the key on how to switch that thinking from, because you can, you drive more. And the reason was that people who could only afford one car got benefits or subsidies to buy an electrical car, and when they have two cars, they drive more. And think of all the light bulbs that we have. Like when I grew up, we had 10 lights on the Christmas tree. Now it's 200. And that you could have LED lights. I don't think the idea was to have 200 light bulbs on the Christmas tree. I think the idea was to save them. But we don't. We just place light everywhere. Even walking paths without the city has light chains up to the mountain. I mean, I don't think the idea of having energy saving batteries and light production, I don't think the idea was that to have, I think people have now maybe 10 outlights around the house, even on walks where they never walk because there's so much snow there. But so I totally got carried away. But my point here is that I'm very sad about the first of this continuous energy production path we are on, to the youth who say are pointing to the challenges with the green transition, that the so-called green transition is nothing else than continuous nature destruction and continuous colonization of our lands. and we haven't even addressed the way we are spending energy. And I think that is part of the solution, in addition to all the rights and everything else I had in my speaking about address at this point. I can send it in writing. I think I just end there.
Please share your wisdom with us and send the speaking points there. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Gunpreet. So, you bring me to the question that I would like to pose to the panel, actually, that something about a required change that is not really technological. The change has to go beyond the technology, switching from one type of technologies to another, that will still drive some demands for the metals because of the green transition. Mind you, with the implementation of a circular economy, the demands should also go down. The change has to be behavioral, right? It's not about technology, it's about what we do and how we see our place in the world and our place with nature, within nature, how we relate to nature. We don't relate to it as a source of commodity or the source of extraction, exploration, something that they take out and use. They're part of it. So
and
that is
our values. I believe that's that.
Yes.
And conclusion.
So I would like just to ask maybe a question to everyone about what changes that are required maybe to be done at the global level, because the drivers that are influencing what is happening in the Arctic right now in terms of the extractive sectors and so forth, they're global. So what can be done from the global level, global civil society maybe, global behavioral pattern, global decision making, what have you, that can assist the Arctic communities, coastal communities, indigenous communities, local communities in their new initiatives and in trying to have this just transition, an equitable transition, and have their own initiatives that are compatible with nature-based solutions, with 1.5 solutions. So what actions are needed from the global level, not necessarily from the point of view of convention or global decision making, but maybe in terms of something else, like behavior or markets. Maybe
if I can go first, I think one of them is what I started with. For example, in the climate convention, we have this indigenous platform, and this is what we could get. We would, of course, would like to be at the decision table, but the platform is a first step towards recognition of the indigenous peoples need to be at the table, and that we have something to watch out. So I think, and we had 2 weeks ago, the CPD convention concluded in Bali and created a subsidiary body for indigenous peoples to bring their indigenous knowledge to the conventional biological diversity. So I think we need to see more of this, that there is a seat at the table where decisions are made for the indigenous people. In order to both respond to decisions and proposals for decisions, the recommendations on how they can potentially harm us. Geoengineering is one of those things that just happened very rapidly without any reflection on what our worldview or our traditional knowledge or indigenous knowledge or needs would be impacted by that new path. So I think it's important to compensate that access to the decisions don't always happen at the table. So we need to also have the knowledge foundation, the science. We need to have indigenous knowledge being recognized, equally valued as science to inform this knowledge.
I think our actually time has come to an end right now of the discussion, but hopefully everybody had an opportunity to express their views and their visions. So I would like to thank our speakers for joining us today to share their vision, understanding, and insights into the possible futures of the Arctic consistent with the 1.5 pathway. I also thank our audience here in the room and also those who are watching us online. Thank you for your interest and attention. In the face of intensifying pressures and competing interests, the need to safeguard Arctic nature has never been more urgent. Creating space for nature amidst these unprecedented challenges means to protect the basis on which the well-being and economic future of the people living in the region depends. Thank you so much for being here with us.
I thought